Well, we have a larger project on the go this time. This mower belongs to Ben, a family member, and he rang me and said, look, he's gone out of his road to provide me with another project because, you know, I might be running out of things to do. He hit something very hard with the mower. Something happened, it stopped, won't start again. Let's have a look and see if we can fix it. I have my suspicions what could be wrong, but let's check the mower out first for a start anyway. This thing is a bit of a beast. It's got the biggest wheels I've ever seen on a push mower. It's like a monster truck of push mowers. It's a 20-inch mulch or catch fighter, limited edition. And Coco wants to play with the ball. Let's get out of the road, Coco. I don't know why you'd have a limited edition mower. I think it's just a bit of a sales ploy. It certainly looks like a beast, as I said. It's branded Victa, which are a well-known Australian lawnmower. However, I believe they sold out to Briggs & Stratton, a large American company, and there's a fair chance that this is all made in China, unfortunately. So it has a 170cc overhead valve 4-stroke engine, and it looks like it hasn't done a lot of work, and clearly it's going to have possibly some damage if it hit something hard, went bang and won't start again. So we'll go through the steps. I have a suspicion that it's possibly bent the crankshaft. Ben did say he thought that may have been the case. If we can get it running as it is, it will vibrate like crazy if it's a bent crankshaft. It may have actually damaged or shorn the key. I know Briggs & Stratton engines used to shear the aluminium key on the flywheel if they had a sudden impact. I don't know if these ones are made the same. This is wood. I'm pretty sure this will be a Chinese-made engine, and I've never had one of these apart. But I think we can at least investigate and see if we can sort it out. If the engine's no good, we may be able to sell parts off it. If we can repair it, we will. If we can't, I think we could probably put another motor on the base. It certainly looks like it's worth it. Okay, let's have a peek underneath. Now, if you own a 4-stroke lawnmower, if you're going to tip it over to change the blades or have a look, always make sure the spark plug, which is in here next to the, oh, it should be in there somewhere, yeah, it's under that shield. Always make sure the spark plug part of the engine is going up. That way you won't get sump oil drain into the cylinder head or into the carby. So we'll tip this one back and we'll have a look at what the blade's like underneath. And the easiest way to hold it up is just to put something heavy across the handlebars, or maybe get the dog to lie across them. Now the blade assembly. Now Australian-made Victas always had a disc blade assembly with swing blades, and that way if you hit something solid, the blades will swing out of the road. This is a typical American design with a solid bar blade, and there's a boss that it bolts to, and there's absolutely no give. If you hit a brick or a water tap or something with the end of the blade, all the shock is passed through the crankshaft of the motor. So there's a pretty good chance it's bent the motor. I'm not going to spin it over until I pull the spark plug boot off, because regardless of where the starter switch or the throttle control is, you never know if an engine's likely to fire, and you don't want that to happen whilst you're holding the blade. Okay, so it can't possibly fire now with the spark plug boot off. Let's move this around. Oh, okay, it's not moving at all. Oh, there we go. Seems very tight. Sometimes they've got a brake on them. It's very tight, so I can't. Oh, actually, that looks to be loose. You can see that movement. Looks to be a little bit loose on the crank. But I think what we're going to have to do, we're going to pull the motor off it. I'm going to take the blade. Obviously, the blade has to come off first before you can lift the motor off it. There's a few bolts just to mount the motor to the base plate of the mower, so it's pretty easy to get off. That way we can have a good inspection of what's going on. Just before we take the engine off, we will remove the spark plug, and that way we can pull the engine over a little bit more easily and just see if we do have a noticeable wobble in the crankshaft. Okay, the spark plug looks pretty good. I'm pretty sure this engine's so clean. I'm sure it's never done much work at all. Okay, now that that's out, we can probably pull the rope over and get the engine to spin more freely. Oh, I can't even pull it with the rope. I don't think it's got a brake on it. I'm not sure why it's so tight. That's very tight indeed. Yeah, something's gone on inside, so it's possibly damaged the sump of the engine. All right, we're going to have to pull this off. Okay, we'll start by removing the blade, and again, if you're even if your mower is perfectly fine and you want to take the blade off to sharpen it or something, make sure you disconnect the spark plug. Okay, there's some big chunks in the blade there. So it's there. I think that's been the impact side. It certainly hit something pretty hard. Now that mounting boss is loose. There we go. They don't come off that easily normally. You've got to get a puller on them. I don't think that's necessarily a problem. It probably shouldn't be that loose on the key. But the bolt was tight enough. Key's a little bit worn. But it was never going to come off with the main bolt done up tight enough. It might be an optical illusion, but that's actually looking like it's slightly bent just from where I'm standing. Alright, we've got 3 bolts to take the engine off, and we have to disconnect the throttle cable. Throttle cable is very easy to disconnect. Just have a clamp, which we don't have to take right off. Should be able to get the cable past it and remove that out of the road. We'll do that back up so that it doesn't fall off. And we just have 3 bolts, which shouldn't be too tight given the mower's not overly old, and they just screw up into the cast alloy housing of the motor. In the old days they used to have a bolt with a nut on the other side. Bit of a problem with bolts though going into the cast alloy is that they can certainly rust in there, almost chemically weld themselves, whereas a bolt with a nut on the other end you can usually undo fairly easily. So as these things get older, they'll be much more difficult to get apart. But then again, they're probably thinking that due to planned obsolescence, these mowers will never really get old. They will work for the first few years, and then the companies expect you to buy a new one and not repair them. Whereas when I was a small engine mechanic, I was fixing mowers and things that were 20, 30, 40 years old because they were designed to be fixed. Unfortunately, those days are gone. Okay, we have one more to get out, and I'm holding the motor so it doesn't fall. Well, so it doesn't fall completely anyway. There we go. Now I'll lower the mower down, and hopefully our block splitter doesn't cause any problems balanced on the other end. There we go, the perfect weight. Okay, let's take this into the bench. Okay, I've just got the engine sitting on just an empty jam tin. They're very light engines, there's certainly not much weight to them. Interestingly, it looks like the sump has been put on with silicone. No gasket, it's just a grey silicone. There might be a gasket, well there wouldn't be a gasket, I think they've just used a cheap silicone compound. Again, not built with quality in mind. It appears to be more dusty than oily, so there's been no oil leaks. We should check that there's actually oil in it. And it doesn't look like there's a great deal. As you can see from the little diagram there, it's supposed to be full to the top here when it's level. It should be pretty level at the moment. And it's virtually empty. Oh, low high. Hang on. Well, that's confusing. Oh, unless that is a confusing sticker. I think that's a plug that goes into the housing down here. So if we took this plastic filler tube out, the oil level should be just to the top of that, like that picture indicates, whereas this is a longer extension and it's got a low and a high mark on the bottom, so between those 2 dots. So alright, Looks like our oil level is okay. Yes, it's halfway between those two dots. That's confusing though. I can imagine some people would fill it up until it's trickling out of here, and then it would be overfull, and overfull is just as much of a problem as underfull on these engines because they're only a splash lubrication. If you have too much oil in there, it won't splash properly and you'll end up seizing it. So very poor that. Perhaps it was lost in translation. But anyway, it has got the right amount of oil in it, and the oil looked pretty clean. So if we're going to pull the engine down, we're probably going to have to drain the oil, but let's just pull the cowling off the top, get to the flywheel and just see how it feels to spin it over. And we will probably take the head off and we'll be able to see the piston moving up and down, see if there's any physical damage there. Once we get it moving, spinning over freer, I can actually put it on its back and we'll just have a look at the crankshaft as it spins over and see if it is bent. Let's start the dismantle by removing the top cowling assembly, which is just a cover really, it's just a shroud. Some of the older models had their fuel tank incorporated and the rope start incorporated as well, but this one looks like it's just a cover. So it'll be interesting to pull this apart. As I said, I've never had one of these Chinese engines. My small engine days were quite a long time ago. The principles are all the same. I guess I'll be probably amazed at how cheap they make them these days, but we should be able to work out what's going on. Although this one shouldn't be too much of a problem to work out because it's had some sort of major trauma and we should be able to see some damage. Okay, let's get the cowling off. It's a bit grubby under here, but it's really just dust. So what do we have? A plastic cowling? Well, there's a drop in quality. Anyway, the engines I'm used to working on all had metal cowlings. I guess these don't rust at some advantage. So the recoil assembly is integral with the blower housing, so you can't take that off separately. So we've got a few bolts around the edge to remove that. Our fuel tank mounts in one side of it. Let's spin the motor around. So our fuel tank's there, it slots in. We have a fuel line that goes straight down to the carby. That feels a bit wet. I wonder if it's leaking. So there's no fuel tap, which is a trap on lawnmowers, and I will talk about that at some stage in the future. Once I get back into small engines a bit more, I might do a few videos on common problems with them and how to avoid them. I would, if this was my mower, I'd be putting a fuel tap in there so you can turn it off. Okay, first problem found. I just got a clamp here to clamp the fuel line, and it's sprung a leak. So it's clearly very cheap fuel line because it shouldn't be old enough to have perished. We've just got to get that clamped just underneath the tank so that we don't lose too much fuel when we pull it off the carby. And we use a pair of pliers to ease it off the carby, off the barb. But yeah, it's going to leak everywhere. Alright, well our clamp's stopping it a little bit. Let's get the tank off the top here. Oh, it's got a clip here. A big plastic clip to stop it. Alright, now we can turn it up and stop it leaking, but we've given our bench a good wash. Yep, it's split the fuel hose. Terrible quality fuel hose. I might tip this fuel into something else, and there's a good chance to flush the tank out, make sure there's no contaminants in there. And I better wipe the bench up. So I've just emptied the fuel into an ice cream container. I always like to look at the condition of the fuel. And if we just pan the camera down in here, it looks pretty good on first impressions, but can you see those shadows wobbling back and forward on the bottom? Yes, there is water in the fuel. Not much, but there's definitely water in the fuel, and it does gather at the bottom and it gradually builds up. We will flush the carby bowl, make sure there's no water in there. But that's possibly through no fault of the operator. It's you get water out of fuel tanks sometimes when you're filling up your car. It just can form from condensation and you don't really notice it. In fact, there's the fuel so clean you don't really notice it. but I can certainly see little blobs on the bottom wobbling around. And a good trick is just to put a little bit of methylated spirits in your fuel tanks. I'm not sure what you call it overseas. Is that white spirits? I'm not sure. We call it metho, and it does help absorb the water in the fuel, and it doesn't cause rusting problems or problems in your carburetor. Now to remove the blower housing, and that'll give us a good indication once we get to the flywheel as to what's going on with this engine. There's one bolt there, another one here. And a third here under the exhaust shield. So the muffler shield needs to come off. And we have a Phillips head screw under here. And again, it's nice working on a relatively new engine. Things come apart pretty easily. And I assume there's another screw, yes, on this side. There's another one under here. Now we can get to this last bolt. They're all the same length. Now we should be able to lift this straight off the top. Now we have a breather hose going through it. Oh, there's another bolt under there. Didn't see that one. Now the housing can come off. Alright, looks okay in there. Flow is a bit rusty, but that's not a problem. And that engine is very tight. In fact, I can barely move that. I reckon it might have bent the crankshaft so severely that it's bound up on the bottom sump of the engine. I think we'll take the head off, because the bottom line is if we've got to pull the crankshaft out of it, we're going to have to remove the head anyway, the cylinder. Or the cylinder head. The cylinder's part of the block. Alright, let's get the ignition coil out of the road. And they're slightly longer bolts than the blower housing bolts. And we just have a stop wire. Should just unplug. And there's our ignition coil. Alright, now we're going to take the tappet cover off. 4 bolts for the tappet cover, and they're all much shorter than the other ones. Let's gently prise this off. And we're going to have a little bit of oil in there, that's normal. No gasket, just silicone or some sort of former gasket stuff, gasket compound. That's going to leak for sure. So these engines are going to look quite dirty very early in their lives. Oh Jesus, I cannot turn this engine at all now. Any wonder Ben couldn't start it again. Okay, I can just turn it over with the ratchet on here. And it looks like the cam is working alright because the valves are moving. Alright, that's gone loose. That should be... we should be about top dead centre on the piston. It's a little bit looser. We have a little bit of valve clearance on each of those, so there's no pressure now on the push rods. So now I'll take the head off. So now we want to get the head off, but before I do that, the exhaust can stay on. We're probably better taking the carby and the air cleaner assembly off, because we've got some linkages. That stop wire can just go out of the road. We just have a breather tube. What's the air footer like? Just a little foam air cleaner. Yeah, it's a bit dirty, it's a bit dry, but yeah, it's been letting a fair bit of dust through actually. We have a pre-filter, but that certainly should be cleaned. That's the least of our troubles at the moment. So I've just got 2 nuts here that will take the air filter assembly and the whole carby off. We have a little hose here from the primer bulb. So it doesn't have a choke, it just has a primer. And all that does, I think, is just force a bit of air down into the bowl, which then forces a bit of fuel up into the throat of the carby. Alright, so that all looks okay. There's a gasket here that looks alright, or at least I use one gasket. The carby should slide off here. We can take this linkage out of the road. That just goes from the governor arm to the throttle on the carby. Another gasket there. That looks good, no problems there. We will check that there's no water in the bowl before we put it back together. But then again, if the engine's self-destructed inside, we won't be putting it back together. But if that's the case, we could probably sell the carby as a spare part. Alright, so the head goes back to there. You can see the bit of a line there is the head gasket. Okay, it's been a few days since I just filmed the last of this. I think I was just showing you where the head gasket is. I've drained the oil and I've let it drain for a few days just to get it as clean as possible in the sump. So we can now take the head off and then we'll take the sump off and we'll get right into the guts of the motor. Now I mentioned earlier that we need to take the head off before we take the crank out. Not necessarily true. We could actually remove the sump and the flywheel and undo the big end bolts and actually take the crank out without disturbing the head. But what's the point of pulling it apart without looking at the piston and cylinder? And to do that, we do need to take the head off. We still haven't established exactly what's wrong with it, but given that it's super tight, and the only thing that it's actually that there's actually friction involved is that where the crank runs through the sump or the bottom of the engine, and also where the crankshaft runs through the top of the engine, and of course on the big end where the conrod joins the crankshaft, and then the piston that goes up and down in the cylinder. So one of those points is providing so much friction that we can barely turn it over. In fact, I can't even spin it now. So I would suggest it's most likely this bottom bearing. It won't actually be a bearing, it'll just be the crankshaft going through the alloy. But if the crank has been hit hard enough to actually bend it and cause excessive friction, we've got a real problem. I can't imagine anything else having an issue. So let's pull it down. Let's get the head off first, and then we'll look inside and see exactly what happened. So to remove the head, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4. There's only 4 head studs. Usually they have at least 6, but it looks like there's only 4. Okay, we'll try and get a socket on those. They probably will be fairly tight. That's the size. They're 10mm. Okay. I'll give them a bit of a jar. Probably moved the camera around a bit, sorry about that. Okay, I've had to recreate this little bit of it for you because with my jarring of the ratchet to undo the bolts, I knocked the microphone out of my camera and I lost audio. So I'm just holding it back together. Once I got the 4 bolts out, I noticed with these rockers that all that holds them in is a pin that just slips in from the top. Now it can't come out when the engine's together because the rocker cover's over here, but it's certainly something I haven't seen before. It's just a loose pin that sits through there, and that's what the rockets pivot on. So the rockers can just come off the top, and I marked this one E for exhaust just in case they're different. They don't look to be any different. So that's as easy it is to get the rockers off the head, and then the push rods that look to be identical come out, and I will keep them with the appropriate rockers just in case they're different, but they look identical to me. So then it's just a matter of popping the head off, and the head gasket didn't stick very much at all. It came off pretty easily, and what we found was it's quite a clean head inside. There appears to be no damage to the valves. The top of the piston shows a few carbon deposits, but not too bad. The head gasket didn't split in half or anything, so we should be able to reuse that. The valve heads look okay. So everything in the top end looks fine. So we need to clean this rustiness up around the crankshaft so that it can slide through the sump and past the oil seal. But I could actually see it looks a bit tight on one side of the oil seal and a bit open on the other. So this crank is, normally they bend down here somewhere, but because it had the boss on it, I guess that protects the bottom half. It doesn't leave much space for it to bend. And of course the alloy housing is probably not overly strong. So I'll clean this up a bit and then we can take all the bolts out and try and slide the sump off. So after cleaning the rust off the crankshaft there, I have now undone the nut on the flywheel, and I just did that by holding the flywheel fairly firm and giving the ratchet a thump. I actually used a hammer, so if you jar it they usually undo pretty easily, certainly on a newer engine. So I'll take the nut off the flywheel and remove the fan assembly. Now the flywheel itself is usually on a taper with a key, and I mentioned earlier sometimes when you get a jolt to the bottom of the engine it will shear the key in half. Briggs & Stratton use an aluminium key so it's soft and it does that as a bit of a protection. This one doesn't look like it's been shorn. No, I think it's shorn when they're sheep, aren't they? Sheared? Not sure. Anyway, we'll put the nut back on flush with the end of the crank and then we can give that a bit of a hit with the hammer and hopefully jar the flywheel off. It's quite rusty in here. I wonder if Ben's been washing the mower with a hose. It might look nice and clean washing the mower to get all the grass off it, but leaving moisture in there is probably not such a good idea. All right, we'll see if we can give this a jolt and jar it off. Hopefully we don't vibrate the camera too much and lose the audio again. All right, shouldn't take much, usually pop off pretty easily. There we go, that's all we needed. So now we can take that off. We use the nut, of course, so that we don't burr the thread on the end of the crank with the hammer. So we can lift that off. And this end of the crankshaft all looks good. So next step, now boy, this is so light now, one-handed. Next step is to take the sump off and then we'll undo the big end and actually pull the crankshaft right out. So that's all the sump bolts. We'll put a little bit of spray lube just around the crankshaft just to help it come off and protect the oil seal a little bit, because you know we might be able to reuse it if we can get things sorted out. Now we need to just prise the sump away, remembering it had that silicon type gasket, so it's probably going to stick a bit. Okay, there we go, she's moved. So there's our sump off. We've got, look at this. I told you I'd be unimpressed with this cheaper engine. They've got silicon that's been squeezed into and resting on the governor. That's not good. What's that, a breather? Everything looks okay here, but except all this silicon hanging in the sump. That's terrible. Why don't they use gaskets? We can peel all that off. We don't want that hanging in the sump. Okay, the actual bearing, it's not a bearing, it's only a hole through the cast aluminium, but it doesn't look damaged where the crank goes through. Because remember, it didn't run after it was bent, so it's only us trying to physically turn it over that's been rubbing. So it doesn't look damaged other than most likely bent. Alright, we can pull the cam out. Now there will be a timing mark. There's a thrust washer there. And there should be a timing dot. There's a dot on one of those teeth, which will line up with a dot on one of these teeth when we assemble it Oh, I assume it's that texture mark there. Yeah, there's a dot. It's not texture, it's probably paint. So that's easy enough to assemble. And the thing should spin over much nicer now. There it does. Let's see what the bore's like and the piston. Oh, it's got problems. It's got major problems in here. Okay, this engine is not going back together. So it's got big gouges down the side of the cylinder. The cylinder in these is, I don't think it's a cast iron sleeve. It's just through the alloy. It's quite soft. And that has big score marks down there. Now, I don't think that's happened from it hitting anything. That's interesting. All right, we don't need to worry about the timing marks because we're not putting this back together to run, but there are timing marks you've got to line up when you assemble it. The cam looks okay. It's got push rods here that run on the cams. Well, they're lifters, I think they're called. And that's what the push rods sit in. So there's nothing else in the sump. The governor assembly's here. We'll take the big end off here and then we can remove the crank completely. All right, we can just get a socket in there to undo the big end bolt, or one of them. Let's turn it around and see if we can get on the other one. Yep, we can get on there. Okay, they were fairly firm, but then they're supposed to be. There's one bolt, and there's the other big end bolt. Now, interestingly, we had, if we've had lack of lubrication in the cylinder that's caused it to score, let's get the socket out of there. I wonder if there's any scoring on the big end from lack of lubrication. Oh, it's got the cap off. And no, that looks okay. There's not bad scoring. But now we can push, well, now we can take the crankshaft right out, get it out of the road. There's our crankshaft. And I'm sure that's badly bent. We'll spin that in a minute and have a good look at it. And we can push the piston out the top and have a good look at the bore. Okay, there's our piston. Whoa, look at the side of it. Geez, they're only a short skirt. That piston's got some nasty scoring, a bit of metal transfer. You can still see all the machine marks on the part that's not scored, so it hasn't done a lot of work in hours. Oh, that side too. So there's some bad scoring there. It's actually the plating. The piston was plated with something and the plating's coming off. That's really unusual. I've never seen that before. Don't know why they plate pistons. Must be a new thing. So anyway, they've got a very short skirt on them. Really short. The oil control ring has no piston underneath it at all. That's crazy. So the big end looks okay. Yeah, there's no bad scoring there. But the piston certainly badly scored. And the bore, let me wipe some oil out of it. Now, how are we going for light here? Have a look at the tracks up the side of that bore. That is terrible. It's totally had it. There's big grooves down there. And the other side too, I think. Yep, both sides. Let's get the light in the right spot. So, yep, it's totally had it. That block is now only cast aluminium scrap. There's no way known you'd put a new piston in there. Why did that happen? Well, that's not a result of the mower hitting something solid. And it would have been hard to start. It would have lacked a bit of power. It probably would have been hard to start when it was hot. Might have started okay cold. Although the skirts of the piston don't really affect the compression. That's the rings. And I don't think they're overly worn. Let's have a look. Let's take a ring off and put it in the cylinder. And we'll drop the piston in. I'll have to take all the rings off. So I'll take all the rings off the piston now, and we can just drop it in to square up that ring we put in. And there's a really good ring grip there. You can see it. It's where are we? Just there. So there's virtually no wear to the rings. That's as you would expect a new engine. So it hasn't got excessive wear, but I'd say lack of lubrication. Maybe it was overfull with oil at one stage, or maybe it got low in oil, or maybe it was run for a short time with no oil in it at all when it was new. I'll have to talk to Ben. But that's what's caused that. Is the piston's swollen up, it's got very hot, it's bound up on the side of the cylinder, it's transferred metal, there's been major friction and damage. So what that means is that the grooves up and down the cylinder means the rings won't seat very well, so it will certainly affect the performance of the mower. That's beyond repair. All right, I don't have to worry about putting this back together, but we do want to have a look at the crankshaft now and see how badly bent it is. So to get a good view of the crankshaft whilst it's spinning slowly, I've just put my cordless drill here onto the end of the crank where the flywheel went, so that end is fine. Although incidentally, I didn't mention, well, I didn't see till later, the flywheel key that I thought was okay, if you have a look at that, it's actually started to shear off, and it's a steel key. So it just shows you some of the forces involved when the mower stops suddenly and the weight of the flywheel wants to keep turning. It almost sheared the steel key. So if it was a repair job, that would have to be replaced as well. You would have to look closely at the flywheel to make sure it didn't crack the cast iron or anything. So I've just got the drill set up through there. The crank is just going to spin in that other end. I put a little bit of spray lube in there so it spins nice and easily. I'll mount the camera in the tripod and we'll just have a look how bad this crankshaft is. Okay, we're straight on. Well, now we're straight on with the crankshaft. Let's rotate it slowly with the drill. It's got a fair bend in it. Let's go a bit faster. So could you imagine that running at about 3600 RPM? Imagine the shaking the lawnmower would be doing. But also it's bent right back past the journal where it runs through the sump, and that's why it was incredibly tight. I've never seen one bend that far in. It possibly may have even cracked the sump. I didn't have a really good look at the cast aluminium. Let's have a look at it side on. So there we go. No more proof required. That crankshaft is beyond use. So now it's time to wrap up this video. We've gone a fair while in this video, but I thought it was worthwhile sharing the repair, or the dismantle, the possible repair options, and then what indeed turned out to be an autopsy. Could we have fixed it? Could I fix it anyway? Well, you know, if my life depended on it, I'm sure I could actually get this motor actually running. It would involve a large hammer or a piece of pipe and straightening the crank, which can be done. It's not a recommended practice, and you can set up stresses in the metal, and when you've got a blade flying around very fast, that could be dangerous. So certainly not recommended, although there are plenty of videos on YouTube showing how you can do it. But then, because this one bent back through into the sump journal there, it would be difficult to get right. You would probably find the oil seal would probably leak. We would have to check that it hadn't damaged the sump, but I didn't see any cracks there. The piston, well, you could just smooth it off as best you can, and you could probably run a hone through the bore to get rid of the rough edges. It wouldn't run well, but I reckon I could probably get it running. What else was there? Oh, a fuel hose. We had a bit of a leak. That's an easy fix. Water in the fuel, that's fine. So it's possible to get it running if my life depended on it, but it would not run well and it would not last long. So it's definitely not a viable repair as far as having a good lawnmower going again. It certainly needs an engine replacement. Now, as far as the autopsy goes, I was thinking while I was rewatching a part of this video, I've worked out why this piston is badly scored, and it scored the bore. And you know, even if Ben had not have hit something and bent the crank, the engine had a very short lifespan ahead of it anyway. Because of this, it would have been, as I mentioned, it would have been probably hard to start when it was hot. It would be lacking power. It would progressively get worse. Now, why did it happen? It was definitely a lack of lubrication around the piston. And what caused that, if you remember when we first pulled the sump off, there was a big lump of silicon sitting in here somewhere, something like that. Guess what this is? Other than being part of the governor assembly, the plastic fins here are the oil. It's the oil slinger, and that it's responsible for splashing the oil around through the engine and getting enough splash up into the bottom of the cylinder to lubricate the piston. With a big lump of silicon resting there, it would have been fouling that. It probably still span around, but it would not have been lubricating properly. That is actually a fault with the engine from the factory, and technically that would have been a warranty claim. It should not have had that. I don't know why they use this silicon compound. It's terrible stuff. It's not hard to cut a gasket. Look at the big lumps of stuff here. So that is why the engine had a very limited life left. I must talk to Ben to see if he had noticed any decline in performance. But what's ultimately killed the thing was hitting something very hard and bending the crank. So as it turned out, that incident really didn't kill the mower prematurely, because the mower was on pretty well on death row anyway. So thanks for watching this longer video, guys. I hope you weren't too bored. If you have an interest in small engines, hopefully you found it very interesting. If you didn't have an interest in small engines, maybe you do now. Sometimes people just like to find out how things work. I know I do. What are we going to do with it? Well, I'm going to box it up. I'll keep the parts. Because it's a relatively cheap engine, I don't think it's worth selling individual parts on eBay like I've done with another engine. Incidentally, I'll get you a report on that or that experiment soon. The carby possibly could sell. The head with the valves is still fine. But I think, given I'm probably likely to get into a few more mower repairs once my shed gets more functional, it might be handy to keep a few spares like that. The block and the crank basically can probably just go to scrap metal. I'll keep a bit of the hardware. So it's not worth selling anything as far as parts go, but it could well be handy down the track. So thanks for watching. I hope you found that interesting. We will do a lawnmower soon, or a small engine soon, where we actually do fix it. This one, just too far gone. Thanks for watching, guys. Catch you in the next video. Bye for now.